Okay, everyone. I was reminded that the second test is coming up a lot quicker than I was thinking. So rather than rush the lecture, uh, let me go ahead and do another recording for you all so we can get this. And then Friday uh, and Monday, I'll have time to finish hopefully the rest of the information. Going back to leading causes of death, the accidental being the first reason due to uh, alcohol consumption for young people. Second, homicide. The third one, uh, I wanted to add one more thing that I told you that the suicide rate has tripled since the 1950s, but in recent years there's been a slight decrease. The other thing now on the PowerPoint, pay attention to, it talks about emerging adults. In chapter 1, I told you about emerging adults. They're people who are in a transition from adolescence to uh, early adulthood. They're still somewhat dependent on their folks. Uh, so emerging adults have twice the suicide or much higher risk. In fact, they're one of the highest risk groups uh, around. Uh, and I'll cover suicide in another section also by ethnicity, but for right now, I think that's enough just on the leading causes of death among young people. I'm now on page 67. I'm going to go ahead and pick it up there. It's talking about exercise, activity, nutrition, and so on. I'm focusing right now on sports based on the PowerPoint that you're following. And I think we can agree that young people are nearly as active in sports as they were a few decades ago, like health and PE classes and so on. But there is a lot of research as far as what are the benefits of kids in getting involved in organized sports where they actually have to go practice and participate and be coached and so on. Well, there are positives and negatives, uh, and obviously the positives uh, is I already told you is social capital, and that's going to reduce risk-taking behavior. And they assume that because they're engaged in something organized, they're being supervised, and so they're not out looking for other things to do. Second, the positive is that they're with other kids who are hopefully engaging in positive behaviors, and so that interaction is good. They may be encouraged to keep their grades up and so on by their friends. And the third one is a sense of belongingness or being connected to their school and be a part of something bigger than themselves. And last, and I see it's not on the PowerPoint, but hopefully there are some sort of standards to keep their grades up to participate, and so they should have to manage their grades at an acceptable level. Unfortunately, there's a downside to kids in sports, and there's such a demand and pressure to win at all costs, and kids are willing to uh, try supplemental drugs, steroids, and so on, performance enhancing drugs, things like that. Kids could also be somewhat self centered, thinking that because they're an athlete, they should be treated differently or special, and that the academics come in second, which is another of the downsides, is sometimes their grades suffer because of the time spent in sports and getting their priorities uh, backwards. On page 69, there's a full page about sleep. It's pretty clear. I don't think common sense just would answer this question. Young people don't get enough sleep. There's an inadequate amount of sleep. It says 45% of kids don't get enough sleep. Well, the problem with not getting enough sleep, of course, you wake up tired, you're irritable, you're not attentive in school, you may be late for class, and so on. What happens in adolescence is after kids go through puberty, there's a shift in their biological clock, basically meaning that the hormone, by the way, you need to know this hormone, melatonin, is released in the brain, and the melatonin induces drowsiness and allows us to go to sleep. Well, after puberty, we seem to have a shift by about 1 hour later when that hormone is being released. And so I don't have it on your PowerPoint, but I want you to pay attention to what I'm about to tell you about a research project in which they went into some school districts and they moved the time at which classes began, and they shifted the class 1 hour later. So in other words, let's say school started at 8, they had school start at 9 to see if it made a difference by giving kids 1 more hour of sleep before they had to be in class. And what they found out was that it did indeed improve both their grades, their attendance, and it reduced their tardiness. So overall, it seemed to be effective, and which did support the idea that kids that show up to school tired are not going to do as well. Now, sometimes in the chapter I omit, so I'm telling you that I'm omitting this section on evolution. It's on page 71, 72, 73, and 74. So no questions from that area, nor do you see a PowerPoint addressing that. If you're following me in the text, then if you remember the first day when I was lecturing, I talked about genotypes and phenotypes. That information is on the middle of page 75, so it's a good quick review. It's just both of those are in one paragraph, so you might want to read that real quickly and make sure you can make a distinction between a genotype and a phenotype. There'll definitely be questions about that. Anyway, picking up on the PowerPoint dealing with heredity, environment interactions, or behavior genetics, that's the next major section I'm looking at, and there are some important information points here for you to take note. So if you look at your PowerPoint, you'll see that research on the influence of heredity and environment on individual differences and human traits in development. I'd put a highlight by that because what they're talking about there is what exactly is behavior genetics. And what they're telling you is the people involved in behavior genetics are very interested in studying the correlation or the relationship between heredity or biology or nature and environment, and that's nurture. And to what degree do either of those have an impact on our development, our human traits, our personality, and things like that. And so the point that I think I want to make here is, first off, that since we're calling it behavior genetics, well, the term genetics steers you towards nature or biology. They're looking at our genetic makeup. And so when they report the degree of the relationship, they report it from something called a heritability index. A heritability index is very similar to a correlation coefficient, except that in correlation coefficients, if you remember, both variables could move in the same direction or they could each move in opposite directions. With heritability index, they always move in opposite directions. As one increases, the other automatically decreases. So there's always an inverse relationship in heritability index numbers. The numbers are the same. You can use the same numbers. Like a 0.5 would be a weak heritability index. 0.50 would be moderate. 0.75 and above would be a strong heritability index, indicating that there's definitely something biological going on here. And so they always report it from the biological side, but the maximum numbers are 1.0. So when you see a 0.80, for instance, heritability index, that tells you that there's a very strong genetic influence of some trait that they're studying, but that also means there is some degree of an environmental influence, like 0.20, because it always has to add up to 1.0. And so if you had a 0.75, then you would have a 0.25 environmental influence, and so on. But they always just give you the number from the genetic side. Now, the reason they use these numbers is to help and assist in treatment. So if we can determine that there's a strong genetic influence, then it's likely they're going to turn to medical, to doctors, psychiatrists, medication to treat it. So some examples that they found is schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, ADHD. You're going to find the first line of defense for all of these or treatment is generally going to be medication. On the other hand, a low heritability index number like a 0.20 would indicate it's something behavioral and should be addressed probably primarily by counseling, and that medication probably isn't going to have a big impact. So an example there might be phobia. So a person develops an irrational fear of something. It's probably not something they were born with, that fear. It's probably something they experienced as a trauma, and they now have this fear, and they're going to need counseling. It doesn't mean you can't do both medication and counseling, but it just talks about what is the first treatment preference. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this PowerPoint. So then the question becomes, well, how do they come up with these numbers? What type of research do they do? And basically there's two things going on. One's called twin study, and the other's adoption study. So that should tell you that twin studies are going to be looking at nature or biology and genetics. Adoption is going to be looking at environmental influence, because there's no, as long as it's not a family member adopting, we'll say a non-family member where there's no genetics associated with the adoption, then it's strictly nurture or experience. And so the example here would be, to what degree is the kid more alike the parent if there's a genetic connection, and how much are they like the parent if they're adopted? So let's look at the twin studies. You can see two columns there. On the left is called twins. It's called twin studies, but it's an identical twin study. So identical twins are called monozygotic twins. Mono means one, or uni means one, zygo or zygotic egg. So identical twins are exactly alike genetically. They have exactly the same genotype for every trait you could possibly have. They are identical. And so the argument would be, well, are they identical on their phenotypes in every trait? And the answer, of course, is no. And so to what degree are they alike or not alike? So the best way to keep this in mind is to, when you have identical twins, when you can point out differences in some trait, let's just say personality traits, even though they have the exact same genotype, they have different personalities. Well, you could argue then that personality is not strongly influenced by genetics, but rather than by environment, because otherwise they should be exactly alike in personality. Maybe let's look at IQ. Again, what if their IQs were almost within a point of each other? Which I'm not saying they would be, but if they were, then your heritability index number for IQ would go up. So to the degree that identical twins are more similar than not, the heritability index increases, and it shows support that it is definitely genetic, since they have the exact same genotype and it's being manifested exactly the same or very close to the same phenotype. So a trait like eye color, hair color, things like that, where they have a lot of physical similarities, certainly would support a higher heritability index number. On the other hand, still under twin studies, you might deal with fraternal twins. Fraternal twins are called dizygotics. Di meaning two, zygo again, eggs. So they're developed from two totally separate eggs, and the statement that the author is going to make is that fraternal twins are no more genetically alike than any other sibling pair. So what does that really mean? If a family had their first child, then later had their second child, we don't expect those two kids to be similar. They can be quite different, in fact, and no one expects them to be alike. But let's say the third and fourth child are fraternal twins. Sometimes we expect that because they're twins, they should be similar, just like identical twins. But the fact is they're not. They're no more alike than the first two kids born into that family. And so why then do we look for similarities? Well, the way the behavior geneticists use that, to the degree that these kids are more similar, it's going to be due to environment. In other words, we're telling them they're similar. We're treating them like they're the same. We treat them like little bookends. We dress them alike. We give them the same toys, they play together, and so there's a lot of environmental influence going on. So if you can keep this straight in your head, to the degree identical twins are alike, hereditability index goes up. To the degree fraternal twins are alike, hereditability index goes down, because it's more of an environmental influence than it is genetics. And so they love to do these studies. So obviously if you could find identical twins who have been separated at birth, they've never met, if they're and they've never even seen each other, but you test them on all sort of characteristics of personality, IQ, and so on, for any trait that they are just alike or very similar, hereditability index goes up. On the other hand, they like to study adoption, in which there's no genetic connection between the adoptive parents and the adopted child. So I'm using an example of IQ, and again, don't go away thinking that I'm saying that IQ has a high hereditability index or not. That's not the point we're arguing here. I'm just using IQ as an example. So if a child was adopted from the biological parents and was raised by the adoptive parents from a toddler and later given an IQ test, ideally what you would want to do would be to, if you could, give IQ tests to all the parents, the biological parents, the adoptive parents, and the child. To the degree that the child's IQ matches the biological parents whom he or she was not raised by, would push the hereditability index number up, showing a strong genetic or biological influence for the child's IQ, that they inherited this from their biological parents in spite of not being around them. On the other hand, to the degree their IQ was closer to that of the adoptive parents than of the biological parents, then the hereditability index number would go down, meaning that the adoptive parents have a lot of influence over the child, helping the child, nurturing, encouraging, putting them in an intellectually nourished environment, an enriched environment in which they do well on testing. And so just kind of keep that in mind. The last thing I think maybe be aware of is if you see an example of twins and it's a boy and a girl, then you know then it has to be a fraternal twin. And if it's two boys or two girls, then it could be identical twins, although it could also be fraternal. But if it's one of each, it's definitely fraternal. So keep that in mind. That could be a simple little test question for you. The heredity environment correlations on page 77. We're moving into something the author talks about, three stages, if you will, maybe is the best way to think of this, passive, evocative, and active. So we're starting off with passive and we end up with active. The best way to remember this is early on in life, children are strongly influenced by their parents and are somewhat passive. So basically what I'm saying is they're going to participate and enjoy and do things that the parents are presenting to them. So if the parents love to read, then they're going to spend a lot of time reading with their child. If they love music and they're musically inclined and talented, they might sing and play instruments and then buy little toy instruments. And the child will pick up on that, and the child will embrace that because that's what the parents are doing. And they call that passive geno-environment correlation. So the child is fairly passive because they're just a small child and strongly influenced by the parent. The next level, though, is called evocative. As the child gets a little older and interacts with the environment, then we want them to become aware that they are doing things that evoke responses from their environment. So this isn't about the child responding to the environment. This is the child behaving in ways in which the environment responds to them. An example of evocative would be comparing a well-behaved, easygoing child in a classroom compared to a difficult child, disruptive, maybe with ADHD problems, severe. And so the teacher is going to respond to those two students differently because of the student's behavior. The teacher's the same teacher, but their response to the child is different. And it's different because of how the child is behaving or what they're putting out there. Eventually, the author says we reach a level in our development which they call active, and it's totally the opposite of passive, obviously. And so by this point, we assume that an adolescent may begin kind of, remember, identity exploration that Erikson came up with at this stage, that they may start seeking things that they feel like they're more interested in, and those things may be different than what the parent has been encouraging them to do because the parents like it. So let's stay with the music example. As a small child, the child may very well learn to play musical instruments. The parents may encourage them to play in the band at school. They play instruments in the marching band and so on. They're very good at it. The parents enjoy it because it's something they like also. But let's say the kid goes out for a sport or plays PE and the coach says, wow, you're really good at this sport. I think you ought to try out for the team. And the kid does. He really enjoys it. In fact, likes it more than the music. Comes home and tells the parents, I'm going to drop out of band and I'm going to join the football team or the basketball team or the track team, whatever it is. And I find that I really enjoy that. And that's what they call active, meaning that the young person is now going to make an active decision as to what they feel fits them the best and what they enjoy and so on, rather than just what the parents have kind of introduced them to at a young age. And they call that active. Let me see what else I have here. Shared and non-shared environmental influence. I think this has been deleted from the new text. So I'll go ahead and just very briefly tell you what it's about, and then we'll move on. But a shared environmental experience would be the things that kids have in common within the home that you can't escape. So if you're living in poverty, everybody in that house is living in poverty. They're all sharing that. If they're living in a high crime neighborhood, all the kids have to deal with that. If they're living with very strict parents, maybe abusive, all the kids experience that, and so on. That would be shared. They have the same things in common as they're being raised. The point here is that sometimes parents will say, why is one of my kids never giving me any trouble, the other gives me nothing but trouble, and I've treated them the same? And so the answer here, of course, is shared and non-shared environmental influence, because the parent is assuming that their experience has been exactly the same in their mind. But that comes to the point of a non-shared environmental experience, meaning they live in the same house, but they don't necessarily experience the same things. And so you might consider things like the relationship between the parent and the child or the siblings. They may have a better relationship, what we call a goodness of fit with one and not so much with the other within the same house. They could have different friends, a circle of friends in which one group is a negative influence and the other is a positive influence. Even though they are siblings being raised in the same household, they could have different influences. Teachers would be another one, and so on. So those are non-shared. These are things that one kid in the house maybe has experienced a trauma where the other siblings have not, and it affects their behavior. That brings me to the end of chapter 2. I'm looking at page 81, and I'm going to try